Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the first talk in the series and in the first day of the new semester of ILR. This series is on addiction, and when or go here. Okay. All right, thank you. And so I can't see anybody.
They see you on the camera, so don't worry.
I can't see anybody. Anyway, I'll go on my tippy toes. Yeah. So addiction, when we think about addiction, we think about substance abuse, we think about pills and teenagers lying around addicted to pills. But addiction has much more than that. In fact, we all have addictions. All have addictions, whether we acknowledge it or not. And the easiest one we are all addicted to is coffee. Coffee. We all need our first cup of coffee in the morning, and we don't even think about it. It's okay. I'll be done in a minute. Yeah, okay. So, so this series, we are trying to cover several different types of addictions, not just the ones you think about, but different kinds, which includes like alcohol and marijuana and pills and mushrooms, etc. But also addictions in youngsters to video, watching videos, or social media addiction, or other behavioral addictions such as sex addiction, which we don't normally think about, but they do exist. So the series of speakers, the 6 speakers that we have here are all, they belong to the Center for Addiction Research at the university. They are from different departments, but they are all in that, working together in that addiction group. The series has been put together really by Joanna Peris, who is the first speaker. She is the associate assistant director of the group, and she's been most helpful, and she's co-facilitator of the course. She will be giving the first talk, and I will introduce her. Joanna is associate professor currently in the Department of Pharmacodynamics in College of Pharmacy at UF. She's the past associate director of the Center for Addiction Research and Education. It says past associate because I think she's getting ready to retire and join us. She received her MS and PhD degrees in experimental psychology at the Oregon Health and Sciences University, and her BS from Bowling Green State University. After a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Colorado in Denver, she joined UF in 1988, and she has been funded by the National Institute for Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism to study the neurobiological basis for alcohol abuse. She has over 60 publications that have been cited several 100,000 times. I'm hoping that she will also, I'm particularly interested, and I hope she will cover this, is what do they mean when they say this is your brain on drugs? What exactly is your brain doing there? And I think she will talk about that and about some of her research and finding treatment for addictions. Joanna?
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Pushpa. So, waiting for the slides. It's nice to be here. I think I gave a talk back in the very first year of the Institute for Learning in Retirement. And so it's nice to be back. And as Dr. Kalra said, I'm in the College of Pharmacy. So my focus is kind of looking for pharmacotherapy for addictions, drug therapies, but not all of the speakers are as focused on drug therapy as I am. And we'll talk a little bit about them in the future. So let's see. Did I just turn the lights off? You did. So again, I mean, when we talk about addiction, we think about common addictive drugs like stimulants, nicotine, amphetamines, cocaine, or depressants like alcohol or opiates or benzodiazepines like Valium or barbiturates. And then, of course, the hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, ketamine, marijuana. And we think of all those things as, you know, once you take them, you just get out of control and you can't stop taking them. My brother just had a minor hand surgery and he was given 5 Oxycontin in case the pain got too bad. And he was afraid to take even one because he didn't want to get addicted. So I think we'll talk a little bit about addiction in the beginning and try to understand the physiological effects of addiction on the body. And then I'll talk a little bit more about my specific research. But, you know, one thing that I think is important to remember is that it's not just drugs that are addictive. There are also addictive behaviors. And some of the talks in this series will focus on addictive behaviors like overeating, gambling, sex, exercise, shopping, and of course, you know, screen time, phones. And I think even just standing here, a couple of people have come up to me and mentioned other kinds of addiction. Like some people are addicted to the news. Some people are addicted to, you know, church or exercise or things that other people seem to be able to, you know, partake in without becoming addicted to it. So, you know, the idea is what's the difference? And so what is addiction? And this is a slide from, you know, I teach pharmacy students, and so I teach them about addiction. And, you know, we think of these common terms like tolerance, that you become used to a drug so that your body doesn't react to it as much over time. And so whereas you used to get a little giddy from having one drink, now it takes you 3 drinks and you're just fine. So you need to take higher doses to get a response. And that certainly plays a part in addiction, but there are a lot of drugs that show tolerance that you don't become addicted to. So, you know, a number of drugs like antihistamines, and there's some blood pressure drugs that slowly you have to titrate your dose up over time, but you don't get addicted to them. If you stop taking antihistamines, you might have allergies, but you don't say, oh, I gotta have it. You're gonna sell your TV set to get it. So tolerance to a drug does not mean you're going to be addicted to it. The other term that we use a lot is, let's see, can I do it over my shoulder? Dependence. We think of people who are addicted that if they don't get their drug, they're going to go through withdrawal, and they have to take that drug to prevent withdrawal. And that certainly, again, contributes to the addictive properties of a drug, but it doesn't determine whether something's addictive or not. So for example, if you're given an anti-anxiety drug like a benzodiazepine, you may have to take a little more of it every day to still get that anti-anxiety effect. You may find that when you stop taking it, you go through physical withdrawal, but as long as you're controlling your anxiety, maybe by meditation or other ways, you're not addicted to benzodiazepines. Very few people crave them, look for them, try to keep taking them, compared to, for example, alcohol or nicotine or opiates, which are very highly addictive. So some drugs, you can have tolerance to them, you can even get dependent on them, but you can easily break away from them. So there's a difference between tolerance and dependence and an actual substance use disorder. And we're going to use the term use disorder a lot in this series because what we're talking about are things that everybody uses. Most everyone drinks, most everyone uses their phone or goes to church or exercises, but when you start to do it more than you should, right? And so that's the definition that we have here, is that you're using it despite the consequences. And if you actually look in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, that's how they define substance use disorders, is when you continue to use either alcohol or a drug, and then we can also talk about other behaviors like sex or exercise, despite impairment from using those drugs, despite health problems, disability, or failure to other parts of your life. And so they're really defined by 3 main things: impaired control, impaired relationship with others, and the fact that when you're using these drugs, you're taking risks to your body, to other people's safety. For example, if you're driving while you drink, but also to, your family, to yourself, because you're using up more of your time and resources, both physical and emotional and, monetary, by using this substance than is really a well-balanced life. So let's kind of focus on this substance use disorder and the things that can contribute to it, okay? So clearly, what kind of drug you're taking or what kind of behavior it is going to contribute to how addictive it is. I've already said nicotine is way more addictive than alcohol or than cocaine. And those are all way more addictive than marijuana or Valium, for example. There's a lot of things about the user, about yourself, that you have to look at, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And then there's also factors in the environment that can affect whether you're going to have a use disorder or not. And so, like I said, the type of drug, think about, and I'm going to put it in quotes when I say drug, because we're not just talking about actual chemical drugs, we're talking about behavioral drugs as well. And so think about cocaine, for example. The tribes in South America chew coca leaves. That's kind of like their coffee. They don't really become addicted to it, okay? Once cocaine was isolated from those coca leaves so that now you could snort it, now it became more addictive. And as you then can inject it, it's even more addictive. And if you smoke it, it's even more addictive. So depending on how you take the drug can really affect how addictive it is. And I think that's even true for behavioral addictions, because when I grew up, there was only 3 channels on the TV set. And you could try to sit in front of it all day and watch it, but there really wasn't that much to watch. But now you got a smartphone that can show you anything you want, anytime you want, and that's tremendously addictive. Other things like, the onset and the duration. If a drug comes on faster, usually you get a bigger high from it. That's more addictive. Whether it's legal or illegal, those things all kind of play into whether something is going to be more addictive or not. But really the final, when we talk about what is your brain like on drugs, is for the most part, even though we're talking about stimulants or depressants or hallucinogens, they all seem to activate the reward centers in the brain. And when I'm talking about the reward centers, I'm talking about a specific set of neurons in the basal forebrain that's important for telling you what are things that are rewarding, what are things that are good. Eating food if you're hungry, drinking water if you're thirsty, social interactions, sex, all of the things that you need to do to survive. We've been programmed for these neurons in our brain to tell us that they're important to do. And they do that because they release a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And when I talk about dopamine, I don't think I'm talking about something too foreign, because I see dopamine in car ads. I mean, everybody, I think, has heard about dopamine as the reward neuron. So the drugs that are more addictive have a more profound effect on being able to stimulate these reward centers in your brain and release dopamine. Okay, and so if you look at an individual, you're going to see all of the different kinds of genes that are involved with how they relate to that drug or respond to that drug, whether they're sensitive to it, whether they have tolerance to it, whether they get dependent on it or not. All of the genes in your body are going to contribute to that. So not every person, even if they took the same drug, are going to be as addicted as another person. And a lot of that isn't just genetic, it's also your behavioral experiences. Certainly, if you had a problem with alcohol in the past, it's going to be a little more risky for you to drink alcohol now. But also things like your personality. Some people are more risk takers. They enjoy doing things that are different or that might be illegal. And that's going to add a little bit to the addictive properties. And then certainly mental health issues contribute to addictive behaviors, because if you're suffering from depression, anxiety, or other kind of mental illnesses, it's very common to want to self-medicate by either, having a drink or losing yourself in your phone, for example. So, and then of course we have to talk about the environment. Is it normal to drink alcohol? Then it's going to be more available to you, and there's going to be a greater risk. Are you stressed out? Is that when you start to think about drinking or taking drugs or wanting to lose yourself in your phone. And then the other, which is kind of a little bit more going to be a focus of my talk, is what other reinforcers are there in your life? That dopamine reward center isn't there because it thinks you're going to take drugs. It's there, as I said, to tell you what are the important things that I need to have a successful life. That's, a source of food, water, money, education, all those things that are reinforcers. Yeah. So that was a good question. I think it was it. Yeah, I was just about to. Yeah. So is there a difference in people who get addicted, who not get addicted? Is there a difference in their reward center on how it responds to drugs? And yes, absolutely. I think that there's certainly evidence for that. And some of what I'm going to talk about today is going to show that same kind of relationship, that if you don't have enough other things stimulating your reward pathway, and then all of a sudden you have a drink and you feel your reward pathway be stimulated, you can see how that could be a little addictive. So, and then just one last thing I just want to focus on is family. Do you have a good support group? It could be your biological family or your okamic family, just people that are there for you, that you feel that you just enjoy being with them and you get reward out of being with them. So, so this is a slide that's really common now in the addiction field. George Koob, who's the director of the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, made this up. And it's a little complicated there, but it basically shows your brain on drugs. And the difference between, the actual taking of the drug when you get intoxicated and the parts of your brain that are involved. And this is that dopamine reward pathway in blue that are stimulated. But then once you stop taking the drug, you go through this kind of withdrawal period, and it could be full-blown withdrawal, or it could just be like a level of anxiety or discomfort, or you're like, I don't know what to do with myself because I'm used to using my drug. And so you start to feel stress from that, and there's different parts of your brain that are associated with that stress feeling. And then, so then you start thinking about, well, what can I do to make myself feel better? Maybe it's almost time for happy hour, I'll have another drink. And so you start to anticipate or preoccupy yourself. And so you can see how it's just this nice cycle of addiction. So when you can't really see these very well, but this is sort of our series of talks. And I'm going to give the first one on oxytocin treatment of alcohol use disorder. And that, again, is going to sort of play into these reward pathways in the brain and how they're affected by alcohol and how other things that stimulate them might be altered in an alcoholic. And then Bob Cook and Yan Wang are going to come and talk about an interesting idea, which is, obviously people who suffer from chronic pain have a real problem with tolerance to opiate painkillers, and then dependence on them, and maybe eventually addiction. And so the idea is that maybe medical marijuana for chronic pain can, even though we think of marijuana as an addictive substance itself, can it help to decrease the more troubling addiction to opiates, and certainly the more dangerous one, because you can overdose on opiates, but you can't overdose on marijuana. So they'll kind of talk about the pros and cons of using what we think of as an addictive substance to treat an addiction. And then Mary Berry and Shahar Almog will come, and they'll talk about its novel therapeutic approaches, but what they're talking about is behavioral economics. And so that's kind of a strange term, but if you think about economics is saying, well, how much do I have in my assets, and what am I spending all my assets on? And am I liking the categories? I spend this much on food and this much on rent and this much on having fun. And when I really look at my budget, am I happy with that allocation? And so they're kind of using the same thing with behaviors. They're helping people to understand the economics of their behaviors. How much of your time and resources and family relationships are you using with this addiction? And is that really how you want to do that? And some interventions to help people to use their their time more economically. And then Dr. Dollery from the psychology department is actually, again, going to talk about using psilocybin, the hallucinogen in mushrooms, to help with addictive behaviors, in particular overeating and obesity. And then Joy Gabrielli is going to be talking about, I don't think so much addiction to media devices like phones, but kind of how phones can play into addictions to other things. So for example, some people get very addicted to the news or to politics. Well, how addicted would they be if they didn't have something all the time that they could scroll and see, oh, someone said this, now someone said this, that becomes more addictive. So I think that'll be an interesting way of looking at how cell phones and other kinds of media can help worsen addictions. And then finally, Dr. Setlow, who's also in the psychiatry department, is going to look at the effects of age, both young, I don't want to say young adults, because younger than young adults, versus older adults, and how that can influence some of those parts of the brain that we were talking about, where you become preoccupied and you start planning your next, kind of interaction with your substance of choice or your behavior of choice. And again, that all comes down to risk-taking and deciding what you want to use your resources on. And he's got some very interesting data in both aged animals and young animals showing that there's differences in risk-taking as you get older. So all of these people, as we said, are from the UF Center for Addiction Research and Education at UF. So now we get to my talk, and my talk is going to focus on my research. I've done alcohol research my whole life. I did my dissertation back in Oregon back in the 80s on alcohol. And I'm a neuroscientist, which for the most part limits you to doing your research in animals, because you want to kind of get in the brain and measure things in the brain. And that's, for most of the time, has been really hard to do in humans, although we're getting really, really good at non-invasive measurements of brain function these days, but that's not what I do. So what I've been looking at most recently is the interaction of alcohol with the reward pathway, as opposed to a naturally occurring hormone, oxytocin, and how it stimulates the reward pathway, in the hopes that oxytocin might be a useful treatment for people with alcohol use disorder. And along those same lines, if oxytocin normally stimulates the brain reward pathway, and if that's somehow affected by alcoholism, then does that kind of predispose you to becoming more addictive? Because now you're changing the ability for other things in your life to activate that reward pathway. So just a little quick introduction into alcohol. I think, half of the US population had an alcoholic beverage in the last month, but certainly they're not all addicted. Only about 7% of Americans report heavy drinking, and I'll define that in a minute, each month. And yet there's a tremendous amount of money, $249 billion, that are lost in the United States due to costs for healthcare for people with alcohol use disorders, for decreases in workplace productivity, for the costs for all of the car accidents and other accidents that occur that either lead to death or, serious illness. And it is the fourth leading preventable cause of death. But I think anyone who knows someone with an alcohol use disorder or struggles themselves with alcohol, just to say it's preventable just really minimizes the hard time people have in trying to control that behavior. So what is alcohol use? So low to moderate alcohol use is if you have one or two drinks, in an evening. It helps you relax. It maybe lowers your inhibition. So now you're telling jokes and you're dancing and doing things that maybe you're a little more reserved person. There's some cardiac benefits from having one drink a day. And some people like it because it relaxes you. It helps you sleep. And, so that's, they used to say that was healthy behavior, but now the guidelines have changed and they don't say that's healthy behavior anymore. But it's certainly not unhealthy behavior to drink 1 to 2 drinks, maybe even every other night. So what's a drink? That's a good question because it all depends on your bartender, right? But a drink is 12 ounces of about 5% alcohol in a beer. I'm sorry, yeah, I gotta look over here. Yeah, in a beer, it's less than that if you're talking about malt liquor, because malt liquor's got more alcohol in it. A glass of wine is even higher concentration of alcohol, so that's why you get smaller glasses of wine. And if you're gonna have a mixed drink, you really gotta make sure you're limiting that 40% alcohol solution to, 1.5 fluid ounces. And I don't know about you, but if you go to a lot of restaurants and you order a drink, you get this gigantic punch bowl that's really probably got about 3 drinks of alcohol in it. So you got to be careful when you think you've just had 1 drink that you really should have done the measuring. So 4 to 5 drinks in 2 hours is what has been defined as binge alcohol drinking or excessive alcohol use. And it's 4 drinks in women, 5 drinks in men, because men are usually a little bit bigger than women. And it's the amount of alcohol that it takes to get your blood alcohol level over 80 milligrams percent. And 80 milligrams percent is when you start to have that sedation I was talking about, so you're not as alert, you have slow reaction times, you might have exaggerated emotions, you're going to have some memory impairment. And all of those things are why it's illegal to drive a car or operate heavy machinery if your blood alcohol level is over 80 milligrams percent. So, it's not a bad thing to maybe, you're having a big party and you have your 4 drinks, but occasionally that's not considered alcohol use disorder, but it does increase your chance of developing an alcohol use disorder if you're not careful. And again, depending on your situation, your stress levels, your genes. And so when we talk about an alcohol use disorder, we're talking about that same kind of binge drinking behavior, 5 or more drinks in one sitting, at least 5 times a month. And that's when now the consequences are, in addition to all of that sedation and impaired reaction time, now you're going to have some real problems with memory. You're going to start to experience blackouts, sedation, and you run the risk of having so much alcohol that you kill yourself. So what are some of the things that you can wrap your head around that help to transition people from that, moderate drinking to maybe occasional binge drinking to now you have an alcohol use disorder? And what we focused on in my lab, as I said, is on social interactions and the reward that you get from social behaviors. And, taking a look at, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous, they really feel that social connections are crucial to recovery from alcoholism. And if you look in the U.S. National Library of Medicine, the risk factors for alcoholism in particular talk about people who have problems with relationships. So, again, not having those reward pathways stimulated by friends and family and social interactions is really crucial to determining whether you might have an alcohol or might be more at risk for alcohol use disorder. So we focused on oxytocin. This is the hormone I was telling you about. That's a very small peptide. It's produced in the brain. It's released from the pituitary gland. So that's this little grape that hangs from the base of your brain. And the pituitary gland releases a lot of signals into the bloodstream that are hormones that turn on different parts of your body, like your adrenal glands or your kidney. And in this case, what oxytocin does is it turns on the uterus and the mammary glands in pregnant women so that they have, they start labor and they start milk production. But it's also important in men too. It's important for regulating kidney function. But even more importantly, it's not just released into the bloodstream as a hormone, it's actually released into the brain. And it goes to a lot of places in the brain. So you can still see there's that little, where'd it go? There's that little grape hanging down there where it would go. But it also projects to a bunch of other places in the brain. And it's important for determining behaviors and particularly social behaviors. So, it's important for pair bonding, which I'm going to call love, between mother and baby. That's why, you just release all this oxytocin so that you'll pass a bowling ball through your uterus, and now you're supposed to love that bowling ball for the rest of your life and give it all your money and food, right? And the only way that's going to happen is if oxytocin also sends connections to other parts of your brain, particularly the reward pathway, that tell you that is the most incredible, wonderful bowling ball I've ever seen in my life, and I will take care of it no matter what. You fall in love with that baby. And again, it's not just the mother, the father, the whole family, but even more importantly, you know, we're a social species. We do well because we work in groups and we live in groups and we can all do what we do best and help each other. So in people, oxytocin is also really important for helping to identify social groups and social interactions. So, you know, one thing I'm going to talk about a lot is the receptor for oxytocin. So if you're talking about a neurotransmitter or a hormone, you've got oxytocin, you know, being released, whether it's released from the pituitary gland or from those connections in the brain. You've got, here's that oxytocin molecule. It's got to react with something in the cell to complete that signal. And so it binds to this really complicated, you know, protein that's in the membrane of the cell. So this is outside the cell and this is inside the cell. And so it binds to that oxytocin receptor. And when it activates that oxytocin receptor, that's what stimulates the cell or the neuron to do something. So without oxytocin binding that receptor, the milk glands are just sitting there doing nothing. But once oxytocin binds to the receptor, it signals those cells to now start producing milk. So as I said, there's only one oxytocin receptor, and it's present and found throughout the brain. So the part that I'm really interested here is the VTA, which is the reward center. That's where those dopamine neurons are, is in the VTA. And they send their projections to the nucleus accumbens. And that's that blue part in that diagram I showed you, which is stimulated by all drugs of abuse or all behaviors of abuse, is they can stimulate that oxytocin release into the VTA, which then turns on those dopamine neurons. And alcohol also turns on those dopamine neurons, as does cocaine, nicotine, opiates. They can all, because some of them do it in different ways, but they all have that little trick of being able to turn on those dopamine neurons. And so you can kind of see now there's this play of, well, if I got to have a certain amount of dopamine stimulation to make me feel good, and I'm going to call that feel the love, right? I feel the love. I feel the love of this group. I feel the love of my family. So I have to have some sort of oxytocin stimulation of that pathway. And you could see that if you're not feeling the love, well, maybe you can drink a little alcohol and feel the love that way. So that's kind of the basis for this talk is there an effect of oxytocin on how people drink? And is there an effect of how people drink on oxytocin? And what's been found, and I'm not showing you a lot of data, just a little bit of data, but I couldn't help myself, is here's a picture of oxytocin neurons and an alcoholic patient and someone who doesn't have a history of alcohol abuse. And these little black circles are oxytocin neurons, and you could see that there's a lot more of them in the control patient than the alcoholic patient. So that implies that maybe there's an erosion of oxytocin signaling in alcoholics. And so along those same lines, people got the idea of, well, if alcoholics are deficient in oxytocin, maybe we can give them oxytocin and it will help them. And this is, again, this is the only table that's in here, the only data that was a clinical trial that was done back in, I think, 2013. And what they found was that if they looked at people who were in an alcohol treatment center, and every day they're going to be going through alcohol withdrawal, they're going to be craving alcohol, preoccupied, they're going to feel anxious. And since they're in an alcohol treatment center, they can ask the nurse to take some lorazepam, which is a benzodiazepine, which helps you feel less anxious. And because you're in a treatment center and it's you know, there's a medical oversight on it, you can get certain amounts of it. And if people were taking oxytocin intranasally, they asked for, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. They asked for 0 lorazepam every day, as opposed to the people who were in the placebo group that asked for, on average, 1 to 2 lorazepam tablets a day. So it seems like oxytocin can help decrease that withdrawal And then also this CWA score, which I'm not going to tell you what it stands for, but it's basically a measure of withdrawal and cravings for alcohol. And so you can see it's pretty high on day one in the alcoholics, and it kind of goes down over days. But if you take oxytocin, it's low to start with. So there's some evidence that oxytocin might be disrupted in alcoholics, and that giving oxytocin might help alcoholics. So our studies in my lab, where we don't have people, we just have mice, is to kind of test these hypotheses that oxytocin normally stimulates the brain reward center to make you feel the love. That also helps you to decrease the need to drink alcohol because you don't need to have your reward center stimulated more. That alcoholics have impaired oxytocin signaling, so they don't feel the love, and that leads to more cravings and more drink. And so maybe, again, treating them with oxytocin would help. So the first hypothesis, there's a little schematic of that dopamine neuron that's being stimulated by oxytocin, maybe helps you to decrease drinking. And so, we wanted to test to see if that really happened. And that brings up the idea of how do you do that in a mouse, right? So how do you test alcohol use disorder in a mouse? And, sort of getting back to this idea of tolerance, dependence, and alcohol use disorder, there's a lot of ways that you can give animals alcohol. You can inject them with it. And that way you could sort of measure how did they react to the first injection over time, and that's tolerance. Or you can force them to drink it by that's the only thing that they get. They're on a liquid diet, for example, and the only thing that they get to eat or drink is this liquid diet that's got alcohol in it. So they're basically drunk all the time. And that would be useful if you were studying dependence. But we were interested in alcohol use disorder. So we wanted the animals to choose to drink themselves and to do it excessively. And that's not easy. Mice are actually smarter than us, and they don't drink excessively. But what we did was we kind of used an idea from one of the professors on my thesis committee, John Crabb, who discovered that if you only give mice alcohol for 3 hours a day, right at the start of the dark cycle, and that's when mice wake up, and they only get it for 3 hours, they will actually binge drink in those 3 hours. And then we combine that with our method of using Jell-O shots, so that animals like Jell-O. They find it, even without flavors in it, just a little bit of sweetener, they find it to be really rewarding. So you don't have to food restrict them or water restrict them or force them in any way. You just put a jar of Jell-O, either with alcohol or without alcohol, in their cage for 3 hours, and then you take it out and you weigh it and you see how much they consumed. And if it's got alcohol in it, they'll consume that 80 milligrams percent level, which means that they're binge drinking. And of course, if it doesn't have alcohol in it, that's your control group. So you could say, okay, everybody got treated the same, they all got gel, but some of them are binge drinking every day. And so then after 8 weeks, we take these animals and we measure their behavior, we look at all their social behaviors, and we also take their brains out, can't do that in people, and measure their brain function. So the first experiment that we did was looking to see whether oxytocin decreased consumption of that gel. And what we found was that, oops, again, I keep hitting the wrong button. Yep, went too far. There it is. That, normally they're drinking those 5 binge drinks. If you give them oxytocin, it doesn't make them stop entirely, but it makes them not binge drink anymore. It decreases it by maybe 40%. And if you gave them a saline injection, they would just drink the same amount as always. And then more importantly, if you measured other rewarding behaviors like food, for example, like the plain gel, they consumed as much of it even with oxytocin. So it seemed to be a specific effect on how alcohol is able to stimulate that reward pathway. So, again, this is a really exciting idea, and there have been more clinical trials that have looked to see whether oxytocin can help people to stop drinking, decreasing their drinking behavior. And some of the trials are positive and some of them aren't. And so what people have tried to do to make sense of it is look at the populations that were in those studies and to see the patients that responded more and the patients that didn't respond. And what they found was that certain kinds of alcoholics were more sensitive to the effects of oxytocin but others weren't. And so maybe the ones who had more anxiety responded better. But again, what was it that was different about those individuals that made it work in some and not in others? But there's also been a large amount of clinical trials done using oxytocin to treat other kinds of addictions, because you could see how not just alcohol stimulating that reward pathway, but maybe also other drugs like amphetamine, opioids, cocaine. And, again, I think there's been enough positive results that oxytocin as a treatment for addiction is going to be, I think, a fruitful road to go down, although it might be that it's going to work in some people and not others. So now we try to understand a little bit more about what was changing in the reward pathway in animals that were binge drinking every day. So again, if you're losing the ability of oxytocin to stimulate this reward pathway, right? That little arrow's down now. So you're not getting as much dopamine, so you've got less reward. And so we tried to figure out if there was a way to measure how much oxytocin stimulation of that pathway was causing social reward. So we did this crazy little experiment where we took a mouse and we put it in this box with 3 rooms in it. And the middle room is kind of the neutral place. And then there's this side that has vertical stripes and a metal floor. And then the other side that has horizontal stripes and a plastic floor. And, you can just imagine they probably go in all 3 rooms about the same amount of time, because it doesn't mean anything. And then we have these conditioning sessions where we force them to be on one side. See, we close the little door there. They have to be on one side or the other for 45 minutes. And on some days, they were on the side with a little mouse, a brand new mouse they never met before, under a cup. So they got to meet a new little friend. And on the other days, they were on the other side with the horizontal bars with an empty cup. And so we did that 8 times in hopes that they would figure out that, oh, this is the room where you meet people, you meet little mice, and this is the room where you just sit there bored. And then you would expect that maybe if you did this test again now, that maybe they would have learned something and they'd say, hey, I like that room where I used to meet the mouse, and I'm going to hang out there. Maybe that mouse will show up. And so the results of that experiment were what we expected, that mice normally will choose the side and spend more time on the side where they used to meet their little buddy mouse, even though the buddy mouse isn't there anymore. But if they were binge drinkers, and these are not drunk mice, they get their alcohol every day from 1 to 4, and we did all this testing in the morning. So they weren't drunk, maybe they were a little hungover, but not much. But you could see that they really didn't care where they went. They didn't care that that side had a little buddy mouse on there. So even though they were kind of forced to interact with that mouse, it didn't give them any reward. It didn't make them like it anymore. And of course, you always got to do a control experiment. So we did the same experiment where instead of a buddy mouse, there were cookies on the one side, and then on the other side, there were no cookies. And as you might expect, they all really liked the side with the cookies, whether they were binge drinkers or not binge drinkers. So this kind of tells us, it sort of supports that idea that binge drinking every day really does degrade the oxytocin ability to stimulate those reward pathways. And if oxytocin is released when you meet a new little friend and you're kind of having fun meeting your new little friend, then you're going to feel good about that and you're going to like that place and you're going to go back to that place. But if it didn't make you feel good to interact with that new friend, then you're not going to really care about that place. So again, this is evidence that binge drinking really degrades social reward. So we did another kind of experiment to sort of test the same hypothesis, that if you could mimic oxytocin stimulation of that reward pathway, that should make you feel good. And if that's changed somehow in alcoholics, it won't work. And in this case, we weren't talking about oxytocin so much as we were talking about that oxytocin receptor. So if, in addition to a loss of oxytocin signaling, you also have a dysfunction in the receptor that hears that signal, then you would have that same deficit. You wouldn't get activation of dopamine reward pathways, and you would feel less reward from trying to stimulate that. And the way we did this was kind of crazy. We used mutant mice, okay, and these mice have their normal gene, right? And in this case, is going to have, like, here's a gene, and then here's a gene that we're calling the oxytocin receptor promoter. So this is how your genes work. They have promoters on them that say, oh, turn me on and I'll make oxytocin receptors. So there's the promoter saying, okay, turn me on. Now I'll start gene transcription. I'll make the oxytocin receptor gene, and then I'll get to this stop codon and I'll stop, okay? And these other genes have to have their own promoters. So what these mutant mice have is they have this new enzyme called CRE that's been mutated into their genes so that anytime the oxytocin receptor promoter says, make some oxytocin receptors, it also makes some CRE enzyme before it stops, okay? So what's the importance of that? Only if you have viruses, right? So now we get really weird. We have viruses and mutant mice. And the viruses we use because viruses are really good at getting into your cells and getting into your DNA and putting their own genes into your DNA. And so this virus has the gene that's turned on by CRE, so it'll only work if there's CRE in that cell, and it'll make these two new proteins, GFP and CHR. And so you end up now with that virus adding these two genes into, so that every time you make an oxytocin receptor, you also make these two new proteins. So what are these new proteins? Well, GFP is a fluorescent protein. So if you inject the virus into the VTA, then any neurons that are making oxytocin receptors are also going to fluoresce green light, right? So you can look at them under the microscope. You can say, which cells have oxytocin receptors? What do they look like? What kind of cells are they? Okay, and then what we found was so the GFP are the oxytocin receptor neurons, and then the reds are dopamine neurons. And you can see that there are clearly some that are both. There are some dopamine neurons that also express GFP, which means they also have oxytocin receptors. So we're looking specifically at those dopamine reward neurons that are turned on by oxytocin, that are turned on by social reward. So we can look at them and we can count them and we can say, well, they don't really seem to be different between sober animals and alcoholic animals, but how are they functionally different? Okay, maybe there's the same number of them, but maybe they don't work the same way. So the other molecule that you stick in there is the CHR molecule. And CHR is a rhodopsin molecule. And some of you might know rhodopsin is the protein that's in your retina, and it's stimulated by light. And if it's stimulated, it turns on neuronal function. And so if now oxytocin receptor expressing cells are also making this rhodopsin molecule, you've made them sensitive to light. And so we implant optic fibers into the VTA so that now we can actually deliver light to the brain and turn on just those reward neurons that would be sensitive to oxytocin. And so what we find there is that we could take those animals, hook them up to this ability to turn on this blue light, and we put them in a box with two little holes in the wall. And mice are curious, so they're going to look all around. They're going to stick their nose in those holes and see what happens. And one of the holes, nothing happens. They stick their nose in there, nothing happens. And the other one, it turns on the blue light. So it stimulates those neurons in the brain. And that's what we think should be like mimicking oxytocin, right? So if you're turning on those neurons that are sensitive to oxytocin, you should have just fooled yourself into thinking you just had the best social interaction there was. And if we look at animals that were either binge drinking or not binge drinking, we find that the sober mice really like that hole that turns on the blue light. So they stick their nose in it a lot. They don't bother with this one after a while. They're like, yeah, there was nothing good about that one. They don't bother. And the binge drinkers, and again, they're not drunk. We do this testing the morning after they had their binge. They, stick their nose in both holes. They turn on that light a little bit. They're like, no big deal. And then they go to sleep in the corner. So again, this kind of highlights the idea that not only is there less oxytocin neurons releasing that oxytocin, but there's also something different about how those reward neurons, those dopamine neurons, respond to oxytocin that makes you just feel less reward from having the social interaction. And so you could see then how if one of the big things that keeps your brain reward system activated, social interactions, family interactions, love for your child, whatever, love for your wife or husband, if that's kind of eroded and that doesn't really have the same love value, then you could see that you might turn to other substances that would activate that reward pathway. So, our next hypothesis is, will oxytocin work to decrease alcohol drinking in binge drinkers or people with alcohol use disorder? And, as I said, if you don't have enough oxytocin, you're not getting enough stimulation, that reward pathway, you're more likely to drink. So now let's artificially give them oxytocin, turn that on, and maybe decrease drinking. But if those oxytocin receptors are missing, it doesn't matter that you turn on that oxytocin. You're not going to get that reward that you were hoping for in that decrease in alcohol intake. And maybe this contributes somewhat to why some people are more sensitive than others to the effects of oxytocin. And again, is it a genetic difference? Is it a difference in their social networks? And those are all questions for the future. I think more importantly, though, oxytocin nasal spray, no problem. It's good to have a drug that helps you with your disease. But what about behaviors? And, I think that what's maybe more likely is that giving that bolus, big jolt of oxytocin intranasally might give you oxytocin, but maybe for some people it's not at the right place, not at the right time, and not associated with the right stimuli. So maybe a better way would be to learn how to increase your oxytocin levels kind of naturally. So, I've just thrown a few ideas up here. Listen, but not just listening, but really look at that person, look at their expression, look at the joy on their face when they're telling you a story. Do things that help you connect with people. Give a gift, share a meal. What about connecting with God or with the universe or whatever your religious beliefs are? There's a connection right there. Dancing, music, going and listening to live music, all of these things. And of course, the last one, making sweet love, all are things that, I think can help to stimulate your own oxytocin. And of course, as we're going to talk about, some of those themselves can be addictive behaviors. But again, I think it's all about balance. So I'm going to talk about all the people who did the work besides me, in particular, Dr. Eric Krause's lab, who provided the mutant mice and helped us to learn those technologies. And then also Dr. Barry Setlow, who's going to give the last talk in this series, who helped us with some of the mouse models. So, and that's my talk.
Thank you, Joanna. That was fantastic. Thank you for the introduction. Before I take on this question, I want to just tell a little story about oxytocin. When I used to teach, I retired in 17 years ago, and when I used to teach hormones to medical students and other healthcare professionals and teach about oxytocin, the only thing that I could tell them about what oxytocin did was, in women, it stimulates labor and stimulates milk production. And I'd say, what does it do in men? We don't know. We have no idea what it does there. And then before I retired, there was this thing about, it has to do something with social behavior. Just some studies were coming out. And interestingly, this is fascinating. One scientist recruited a couple and persuaded them to measure their blood oxytocin levels while they were making love. So it was in another room. They had a blood line hooked up. So they were drawing the blood, and the couple were doing what they do, and the scientists in the other room were drawing the blood. And interestingly enough, blood oxytocin levels went up. So it supports your theory right there. So this is fascinating to me. And I was seeing that all the references that Joanna had for oxytocin's effect on social behavior were all after I retired. So I knew nothing about this. Thank you. Okay, questions? Phyllis?
I was so stimulated. My oxytocin levels are up. But thinking about people that I have related to and their alcohol problems, is it possible, I don't, this is not part of your research, I don't think, but is it possible that there are epigenetic changes due to childhood trauma that
Yeah.
reduce the receptors in the brain
Yeah. Well, I
and
mean,
predispose people to addictive behaviors?
I think definitely there are going to be changes that occur throughout your whole life that can affect how you respond. And some of them might be epigenetic, where it actually changes what genes are expressed and what genes turn into what proteins. But also think about your brain and all the connections it makes and how it makes those connections and what it associates with what else. I mean, we go through our life learning all the time. Like I learned sort of how to use this thing today. And, so we're always learning things. And if you learn that your parents are scary and you don't really want to be around them, and so who do you go and cry to when you're sad and lonely because you're just going to get yelled at or hit? So you could see how it's not just epigenetic changes, it's also behavioral conditioning and also the function, of your brain. If you learn something enough, you learn a habit, you have to really completely unlearn it. And that's a really hard thing to do. And so again, I think, Alcoholics Anonymous has some success rate, but it doesn't work for everyone. And I think it works for people who can still connect with other people. And maybe they're not making those connections in their family because there's a whole history of bad behaviors. Like, I don't talk to my sister because every time I do, she judges me, and why even bother? Da, da, da. Okay, well, we'll take her out of that circle. Now I'm going to be in a different family, my AA family, and we're going to talk through problems, and we're going to learn new approaches. We're going to learn how to argue constructively and those kinds of things. And I think that then you build a better support system than the one you just randomly got, whatever your family is. So, but AA doesn't work for everyone. Yeah.
We have a question here on Zoom. Keith Berg, if you'd like to unmute.
Yes, thank you. It's fascinating talk. The question, and maybe you answered this and I just missed it. That would be about an addict, let's say in alcohol, somebody who's addicted to alcohol, but then goes into recovery, whether it be a mouse or a human. Has that been looked at in terms of what the changes in the receptors, oxytocin receptors, or the production of oxytocin?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting area of research. And there has been a lot of study, even in people and in mice, where, you'll train them to press a bar to get their drug, their alcohol, and then you'll make them extinguish from that. And they don't get to do that anymore. And then you put them back in there and they're like, yeah, I don't know. But then you stress them and all of a sudden they're pressing that bar again. Or you give them cues that remind them, like you give a little bit of that drug so they get, oh, that's right, that's that high, and then they're pressing that bar again. So there are a lot of studies on relapse, and some of the work with oxytocin has looked on its ability to decrease that relapse. So there's some into that area. But in terms of how it changes the brain wiring, and I think that's the really difficult part, is because use disorders, whether you're talking about alcohol or drugs or phones or whatever, you've learned that behavior really, really well. And it's become an habitual behavior. And so you have to really learn how to do other things instead. And so one of the studies that I think was just so interesting was that if they, these mice are bar pressing for their cocaine in this study, and then they go through this period of time when they don't get to have any, but if in that period of time they got to instead bar press to have interaction with another mouse, then when they went back into the relapse situation, they didn't relapse as much. So it kind of implies that if you can, bolster the oxytocin system in place of and teach them to do something more social in place of the addictive behavior, that's maybe you'll be a little more successful in changing those habits.
What did you mean by listen with your eyes? And also, what was the other thing? You mentioned live music, live,
Yeah.
and I think I know why, but also music just in my apartment is a tremendously stimulating thing. But also, I just want to make the comment that I think to your list of mental conditions, it would be maybe possible to add ADHD, I think,
Absolutely.
as a mental condition that drives some people to look for addictive
Absolutely.
things.
Yeah, I agree. So I totally agree with you there that I think ADHD is a definite predisposer. And what's interesting about that is women who drink when they're pregnant, depending on how much and how often, will increase the chances of their child having ADHD, which is also going to increase their chance of developing an addictive behavior later. Listen with your eyes. What I mean by that is you're not just listening to someone, but you're really focused in on them. You're not just hearing the words, but you're watching their face, you're watching their mouth, you're looking at how excited they are about it. You're really connecting with them. And in terms of music, I think, obviously if you go to see live music, that's a social experience, right? And there's people and you're watching these people doing something they love and enjoying it and working together and playing off each other as musicians. But even listening to music, I think it's even though you're there maybe by yourself, you're listening to something that other people have done. Just like reading a book or enjoying art, you're interacting with them in an indirect way, but I think it also makes a connection in your brain.
Let's go to Zoom real quick. Rick Gold, go ahead, and then we'll go back here to Bill.
Yeah, thanks so much for a really lively presentation.
Thank you.
Among the issues that or activities that you said might raise oxytocin levels is prayer. And I've been following, as an advocate of separation of church and state, the efforts of courts to impose AA 12-step programs on people who come to the court with alcohol-related problems. Has there been research on the impact of prayer on oxytocin levels?
That's a great question. I don't know the research. I promise you, if I looked, I'd probably find some people who were doing it. I think the important thing to keep in mind about AA and about other ways of spiritual growth is it doesn't always have to be a Christian religion, right? It doesn't always have to be a God religion. You're just believing in a power greater than yourself in AA. And they really try to stress that because they don't want to shoo people away who think, oh gosh, I'm going to have to be baptized now. Just accepting the fact that there is something other than you in control of life. And I think we should all accept that as a fact, no matter how much we want to control life. And maybe it's nature, maybe it's science, maybe I used to go to a 12-step group, and this one woman said she decided it was Lee Iacocca, but the bottom line was it wasn't her, right? She wasn't responsible for everything. And if you think you're responsible for everything, that's a whole lot of stress. And if stress is going to make you drink, then you've just written yourself a ticket for drinking, right? And so, I think it's interesting what the connection of that would be to oxytocin. Maybe oxytocin, if you're connected to others, you don't feel so responsible for everything. I'm not sure. It's probably over-interpreting that, but that's kind of the idea there. And again, whether it's prayer in a church, in an organized religion, or if it's just yoga, and when you do yoga, you meditate and you think of nature. I think it's kind of all the same, connecting with something outside yourself. Yeah.
The question that I have, I would like to try to interpret what you just said, all of what you said.
Uh-huh.
So an addiction like alcohol or drugs or whatever is a mental condition. And if there's a cure for it, the process of extracting yourself from that addiction is to really, really learn something else like dancing or petting a furry animal or whatever, that would take the place of that?
Mhm.
That's the interpretation of everything you said?
I mean, it sounds easy, right? And it's certainly not that easy.
No, it does not.
There are physical changes, there are mental changes, but I think in terms of long term, right? In terms of long term, you're talking about a use disorder where you used all of your time and energy on one thing, whether it was alcohol or gambling or your cell phone. And now you have to learn, if you're not going to do that thing anymore, you've got to learn what to do with all that time and all of those resources. Otherwise, you're going to go back to your default behavior, which is that. I think that it's a slippery slope. I think there are a lot of people who have put a lot of years into sobriety and rebuilding their life and having success, and then find themselves back into that alcoholic or whatever addictive behavior again. So it's not just as simple as I said, pet a furry animal, but it's sometimes it's a lot of little things that hopefully you can maybe all try to work together to help your chances of success, is kind of what I was talking about there. And again, I think in my talk, we're not talking about alcohol use disorder already developed. We're talking about the transition from occasional binge drinking to an alcohol use disorder. And so maybe the success of some of those interventions are better before you become a full-blown alcoholic.
I have a simple question. What's the difference between oxycodone and OxyContin?
Yeah, a lot of people think I do research on OxyContin. They're two different compounds. OxyContin is a trade name for oxycodone, which is a molecule that mimics the endogenous opiates in your body. So it's like morphine. And oxytocin is this peptide that's naturally released from your brain that's involved with social interactions. Yeah.
I think, is there any question on Zoom? Okay, thank you, Joanna. This was fabulous. Next week we have a talk by two speakers, Drs. Robert Cook and Yan Wang, and they will talk on the use of medical marijuana. Are we treating an addiction or creating one to medical marijuana? Should be very interesting. Please come. Thank you.